Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Open Minds Show. I'm your host, Christopher Balkrin, where I'm attempting to explore the world's biggest topics with genuine curiosity. So, here's a statement that I'm sure you've heard before, and that is trans youth are more likely to have suicidal ideation, suffer from depression, and actually commit suicide than non trans youth, trans being transgender. And this is a continuation of episode 1, where I discussed why the CBC, Canada's national broadcaster, on its main page has reposted the story of Egan Johnson, a non-binary individual who discusses their top surgery, or otherwise known as the removal of breast tissue. And so going back to that statement of whether or not trans youth commit suicide in high numbers, or higher numbers than non-trans youth, is actually less factually clear. And I know that's a bold statement, so let me back that up a little bit. We know that suicide rates amongst young people are actually quite low in some countries. Here in Canada, the suicide rate actually doesn't differ that much by age group. So according to StatsCan, suicide rates per 100,000 Canadians between the ages of 15 to 29 were approximately 11.9, and that was compared to 11.5 for 30 to 44-year-olds, and then 12.5 for Canadians aged 45 and older. But why young people, in terms of young people, I'm referring to the ages 15 to 29, commit suicide is a bit challenging. Now, let's back this up. Why anyone commits suicide is a bit challenging because there is a level of self-reporting that we need to help understand and assess suicidal ideation, etc. Now, there's a lot of empirical data about depression levels, anxiety, impacts of the economy. There are all types of correlations. But when it comes to young people, this is quite interesting, and this is not my data. This is from Statistics Canada. Social determinants are a major factor. Income was associated not only with physical health, but with mental health, specifically for young people. Young people living in the poorest households were less likely to report excellent or very good mental health, and more likely to report having seriously contemplated suicide in their lifetime. We also know that the usage of alcohol and drugs for a variety of reasons, to relax, to have fun, to experiment, is also used as a coping mechanism with problems that young people face and to deal with negative feelings or even to overcome boredom. This is not, again, my words. These are directly from Statistics Canada. So we know that low income and perhaps even extreme low income contribute to a young person's decision to committing suicide or have suicidal ideation. But nowhere in the StatsCan report did it discuss whether or not that youth was transgender, nor did it ask youth about their gender identity and sexual orientation. That could be a flaw in how these surveys are designed. And perhaps better designs will ask those questions. And perhaps we will see a proliferation of trans youth committing suicide when the question is asked. So perhaps the design of our surveys have not captured trans youth in committing suicide. And that truly is a limitation of these surveys. But that said, there's another wrinkle to the idea that trans youth commit suicide in higher numbers than non-trans youth. And that is that there is more and more research about the linkages and the intertwining of gender dysphoria as well as autism spectrum disorder. We know that youth who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder have a higher likelihood of suicidal ideation and depression. Now, if you also have gender dysphoria as well as autism spectrum disorder, it gets a bit difficult for researchers to separate that out. It's also less clear that gender-affirming surgery, like the removal of breast tissue, top surgery as it's known, actually leads to an improvement in mental health for recipients. Specifically, and this is research done from the the National Library of Medicine in the United States, It says gender-affirming surgery in appropriately selected gender dysphoric patients is associated with decreased post-operative rates of SSRI or SNRIs used and improved mental health. Now, SSRI and SNRIs, I believe, are types of drugs used to treat depression, etc. So we do see in appropriately selected gender dysphoric patients, there is a decrease in the usage of those drugs and an improvement of mental health when gender-affirming surgery is done. So this shows that the qualifiers are really important when we're talking about the issues the trans community is facing. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that suicidal ideation does not happen in the community and suicide as a result does not happen in the community. Of course, it definitely does. But we have to be very specific if in fact it is solely based on someone's sexual orientation, gender identity, or if it's a conglomeration of other issues that are also happening in that person's life. And that's where bold statements like trans youth are more likely to commit suicide is very misleading. It's a misleading statement to say. It very well is the case that that could be it, but it would be necessary to do more research to isolate for that youth being trans and trans only. Based on the research that we do have, we know that income is a much greater indicator of a youth's suicidal ideation and committing suicide. These are very dark topics, and they're not ones to be taken lightly, but the way in which we frame these topics is very important for our discourse. We have to look at the research and make empirical statements from them. We can't deduce from the research a narrative that we want to portray, if that makes sense. We have to look at the research and say, well, what are some of the limitations of the research as well? And one of the major limitations when it comes to looking at gender dysphoria, specifically how it leads to depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation for trans youth in particular, is in fact many studies are very limited in the sample sizes that they have. So the research that we do have is actually quite limiting. And then there's also new research that's coming out that actually says we need to do more research because there's not enough of a sample size to make empirical claims. And so, all of this said, it's very vital that we stay away from trying to deduce a conclusion that we assume, but we don't necessarily have the facts behind it to support it. And that's okay, because this is part of the knowledge and awareness building. And there are countless stories of trans youth out there who have committed suicide on the basis of, being socially outcasted, of being distanced from family and friends, of not being accepted even in their own households. And those are truly tragic stories. But to surmise that all trans youth are at risk, or most all trans youth are at risk of suicidal ideation and suicide on the basis solely of them being trans, again, is a misnomer. It is not factually correct. I wanted to also mention that the comments on my first video were interesting. And I have to say, first of all, thank you to those that have commented. I am also trying to get better too in my comments and my responses. But one thing that I find interesting is that, again, there's a lot of grandstanding and a lot of sometimes condescending attitudes that are happening in the comment section. I want to let people know I read your comments, but we need to move past the grandstanding and the I know what's best. I think we have to be much more humble in how we approach these topics. For example, this person writes, trans awareness should be taught from a younger age, although still in an age-appropriate fashion. Very young kids can be aware of being trans. Education stops bullying, and having a more open environment that lets children play around with their gender identity in a safe environment is good for both cis and trans kids. I want to pause there for a second. I am not sure, and please someone tell me in the comments, if in fact more awareness of trans issues at a younger age leads to less bullying. I don't know that to be a fact. I think awareness is good generally, of course, but does that lead to less bullying? In fact, this person even says, education stops bullying. I don't know that to be a fact because I would go back to many authors, one being Jonathan Haidt, who has said repeatedly, just because you take ethics courses doesn't mean that you're a more ethical person. I mean, that's a really interesting take and certainly maybe not fully applicable here, but in effect saying you can take all the courses you want. It doesn't necessarily translate into your behavior. So for example, many people, including myself, have advocated for more financial literacy courses at a younger age because, especially in this economy, understanding debits and credits is so important. But there's less evidence to show that taking financial literacy courses makes you, quote unquote, better with your finances, whatever better is. It's hard to measure what that is, but I would say, does that make you more informed in your financial decisions? Well, it's hard to say because many things happen in your life and it can totally reroute you and your finances. And when catastrophe strikes, you may not draw upon that financial literacy course that you took in high school or in university because you're trying to survive a catastrophe of whatever magnitude that is. Or perhaps the good times are rolling. You're always up, your investments are always doing great, and you make a risky investment. We've all been there. And you make a risky investment and it doesn't turn out the way you wanted it to. Okay, well, is that a result of you making a tough decision? You making a decision in a market that was only going up? Of course. That's not reflective of the course that you took in high school. So I'm less convinced that education stops bullying. I don't know if that's true, but if you do have research out there, let me know in the comment section below because I would be curious myself. And I think this, in fact, is the challenge that we're having when it comes to trans issues. Some of us believe that more exposure leads to more awareness, leads to better, more inclusive society. And I would argue that's not necessarily true. That may not be the case, particularly when children are coming in not fully understanding the LGBTQ community, etc. They not only exist as a student at a school, but also a child in a household with different beliefs and different value systems as well. And so I don't know if education stops bullying. I would argue that may not be the case. And so from these points, I want to re-emphasize how important it is that we rest our statements on some empirical fact and we open ourselves up to, I don't know. And I think that's okay to say, because what's very much more detrimental to our public square is saying things with such validity and not being able to change when evidence changes. And like I said before, some of the biggest indicators of childhood suicide isn't sexual orientation, but is more income-based and alcohol and drug use. And of course, the limitation could be we did not ask these youth what their gender identities and sexual orientations were. And that's a limitation of the study. And it very well could be that more trans youth are committing suicide at a larger, compared to non-trans youth. That could be the case. But there's just not enough research to show that to be empirically true. And that's okay to say. But I think the bigger question is, how do we as a society wrestle with awareness and understanding while not coming across as advocating the adoption of acceptance when people still have questions about the trans community? And those are ugly, uncomfortable questions, but they're questions nonetheless. And just because we don't want to ask them doesn't mean people aren't thinking them and will retrench from engaging if in fact those questions aren't being asked and answered comprehensively. And I think that right there is what it takes to build awareness and understanding. It's delving into the really tough and challenging conversations we really don't want to have. But what do you think? Do you think that this is correct? How can we build awareness and understanding? And does education stop bullying? Let me know in the comment section below, and let me know what you think of the Open Mind Show in episode 2.